me ask you something. When's the last time you had an adventure? When is the last time you did something challenging and exciting? When is the last time you went exploring? When's the last time you took a risk or did something bold? Many of us lose our sense of adventure as we grow older. Perhaps we have aches and pains that we didn't have as a younger person, which inhibits us from adventuring. My guest today is fond of saying that adventure has no age limit, and she's dedicated her life to helping older men and women overcome the aches and pains associated with arthritis so that they can live the adventurous lives of their dreams. Hello, and welcome to the Over 50 Health and Wellness Show. I'm your host, Kevin English. I'm a certified personal trainer and nutrition coach, and my mission is to help you get into the best shape of your life, no matter your age. We have a great show for you today. Dr. Alyssa Kuhn is with us, and she's going to help us keep the adventure alive as we age. But before we get to that, I want to let you know that today's show is brought to you by The Silver Edge. The Silver Edge is my online personal training and nutrition coaching business where I help you get off the exercise and diet hamster wheel and start making permanent healthy lifestyle changes so that you can enjoy the second half of your life with strength and confidence and show up as the healthiest, strongest, most vital version of yourself, no matter your age. If you're interested in learning more, send me an email at coach@silveredgefitness.com and we'll start a conversation. My promise to you is no hard sales pitch, no annoying, incessant follow-up emails, just an introductory conversation about you and your personal fitness goals. Okay, enough of that. Let's get on with today's show. My guest today is Dr. Alyssa Kuhn. Alyssa is a physical therapist, author, arthritis specialist, and founder of Keep the Adventure Alive, where her mission is to educate people that adventure is still possible with arthritis and that surgery is not inevitable. She's revolutionizing the way people think and feel about osteoarthritis. Now, Alyssa is neither over 50, not even close, and is not herself an arthritis sufferer. So I wanted to know what drew her to working in this specialized field.
So I've always been in the fitness world growing up. I've always been in sports. And so the typical, career path was I want to be a physical therapist. And I've known that for a while. And so I think I just really wanted to be in the medical field and really wanted to help people overcome injuries and things like that. But I never would have thought in a million years I would get involved with people that are older, especially I was treating people that were 70, 80, 90 for a while. And that is just when I fell in love with it. Because you always go in kind of, I want to treat athletes, I want to work for professional sports teams. And so it was a really interesting kind of transition. And when I was doing that, I noticed that so I kind of saw both sides of aging. I saw one side where I was in an independent living facility. These people were 70 plus. They were independent. They were social. They were doing all kinds of things all the time, moving around, doing so many things. And then I saw on the other side, when I was doing home care, I saw people that had arthritis primarily and some other things going on, but were debilitated and had limited mobility at 40, 50. And so there's definitely two sides of aging, and arthritis plays a big part in that kind of success story. But it was so amazing to see, these people that were thriving in their 90s. A woman would wake up every morning and go swimming and do all kinds of stuff. And so that's kind of what kind of pushed me towards what I'm doing now with arthritis. Like, you can adventure, you can thrive, you can do all kinds of things. And plus I'm leading my own adventures and working on my own health and things like that. So physical therapy kind of aligns right with that too.
Okay, yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I think that's a very interesting perspective there, that there are two sides to aging, right? Specifically, I speak to people over 50, and a lot of the folks that follow me are already on that active side of that, right? But obviously I would
luckily.
like to speak also to the people on the other side to invite them over onto this side. But when we think
Exactly.
of that aging, especially when you get to the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the prevailing thought of these people is that they're not active, they're not adventuring, they're not living their fullest lives. And a lot of that is because of lifestyle diseases. And certainly we're going to talk a lot about arthritis and things like that. And they're not able to live their life as their fullest. So I want to talk a little bit about arthritis specifically. Obviously, let's define arthritis. What is arthritis?
So arthritis kind of globally is a disease of the joints themselves. And there are different types of arthritis, and each type brings in its own symptoms and things like that. Now, typically when you say like, I have knee arthritis or I have, hip arthritis, typically people are talking about osteoarthritis, which is generally characterized by stiffness in the morning that dissipates after movement. So usually after about 30 minutes or so. General joint stiffness, like after some activity or following inactivity. And then also joint pain is a big part of it. Kind of changes the way you move, and then we start to kind of go down that path of not moving and things like that. So I would say pain and stiffness, and then the loss of range of motion. So maybe if your joints aren't moving as well, those are kind of the three hallmark symptoms of what's called osteoarthritis. Now there are other kinds like rheumatoid arthritis, which kind of is its own animal just because it is actually an autoimmune condition, and you can get other systemic symptoms like fatigue, and your joints are warm and they're sometimes even hot, and you do have some of that stiffness. They tend to affect some smaller joints too, like hands or feet, that sort of thing. But you can also have rheumatoid arthritis that's affecting the larger joints. I also kind of group degenerative disc disease in with osteoarthritis just because it kind of presents the same and it reacts to the same treatments usually as osteoarthritis. And so that's kind of the main one and one of the most common ones. You also have like psoriatic arthritis and other kinds of things, but those aren't as common. And I've particularly narrowed down into osteoarthritis just because it's a very, very common disease, and there's no cure, but there is hope, and a lot of people really hit these huge barriers, which then leads to that kind of negative side of aging or kind of sliding down into, the limited mobility. And it's being diagnosed at a younger and younger age. I have people in their 30s that are like, I have osteoarthritis now. What is 50 going to look like for me? And so that's kind of the whole entire thing of osteoarthritis is very discouraging in our society right now, but it's kind of pushing into, and I know that your audience is a lot of very active people, and continuing to encourage people to be active, even if you get a diagnosis of osteoarthritis or start to experience some joint pain, joint stiffness, that sort of thing.
Okay. Yeah, I definitely want to come back to that, to the activity. And in fact, one of the folks that I had on the podcast earlier is a CrossFit champion. She's a champion in the 55 to 59 age group, I think.
That's so
two-time
cool.
champ now, I think. And she's got rheumatoid arthritis. And so certainly these things can be overcome, right? She's the fittest woman in the world and is dealing with a type of arthritis here. Now, so you talked a lot about what you might feel if you have this arthritis, the stiffness and joint pain, the loss of range of motion. What causes osteoarthritis?
And so this is actually one of the biggest myths when it comes to arthritis is it is not necessarily caused by wear and tear. A lot of times, we're told that because you played too many sports when you were younger, or you ran too much, or, things like that. And that's actually not true. There's been a lot of upcoming research and recent research going through what is the cause of it, because it's not necessarily wear and tear, because you can have the same x-ray and one person may have pain and the other person might not even know that their joint looks like that. And so they started diving into, okay, what is the difference? Why does one person have pain and one person doesn't? And it's actually, and this should not necessarily come to a surprise for anyone, but it's low-grade inflammation. And that tends to be kind of the stem of a lot of chronic disease. So it's more than just the wear and tear. And the reason why that's important is because if you're told wear and tear causes it, then movement likely is not going to be in your repertoire of treatments, because the more you move, then the more damage. But that is not true. And so some of the causes are the things that can cause inflammation. So obesity is one of them. Just the more weight that you carry, the more inflammation you have in your body. Actually, diet has a ton to do with inflammation. And like I said, this is the same with most chronic diseases, but I mean, processed foods, all that kind of stuff. There are certain foods that actually increase inflammation, and processed sugar is one of them. Also, inactivity. And this is a big one that can fuel that vicious cycle that you think it's wear and tear, you stop exercising, but then you're actually fueling that inflammation by not moving. Those are kind of the three big ones. Also, there are two that are a little bit out of our control, which is okay because like you said, you can actually overcome these things, but genetics plays a big part, but it's not, we can't just say, it runs in my family, this is just what I'm going to have to deal with, because I know a lot of people that have definitely overcome that. And the other one is if you had a surgery, this is primarily in knees, but can happen in other surgeries too, but like ACL, MCL, any of those sorts of things, that can actually put you at risk for developing osteoarthritis. But again, as your audience is very active, being active is one of the best things to help combat that, even if you've had one of those surgeries in the past. Even though your risk is higher, you can negate some of that severity of the symptoms actually developing.
Okay, so what I hear in there is there's a couple of factors that are more or less out of our control, right? If you've had some type of big surgery in a joint, that could put you at risk. And certainly genetics, we could talk about gene expression, epigenetics, but your genetics, you're not going to change. Right. But you talked about obesity, diet, and inactivity as being three things that are certainly within our capability for controlling. Mm-hmm. So we're looking at risk factors for osteoarthritis if folks don't have it and they want to avoid it. Certainly keeping a healthy body weight, keeping moving. Diet plays a big part in that. I will come back to that, I think, and pick that apart a little bit. So what are some typical treatment plans? If I go to my just general doctor and he says, oh, you've got OA, what's he going to tell me?
So this is another thing where it gets a little bit muddy, because he probably will tell you, you need an x-ray, whether he can do it or refers you out to somebody who can. Then they'll look at that x-ray, see some what's called joint space narrowing, which essentially your joint space narrows. Loss of cartilage, deterioration, degeneration. You start to hear some of those words and you're like, oh my God, this is so much worse than I thought. This is so much worse than it feels. And then you are typically, when you see some signs of that sort of thing, you may be referred right to surgery, saying surgery is kind of your only option. Or unfortunately, a lot of people are told, you know what, you're probably going to need surgery in the next few years. So just kind of try to get by with some medication. So anti-inflammatory medications. And sometimes you may be offered a cortisone shot, which is a steroid injection right into the joint, which can be helpful for initial pain relief, but is showing some potential signs of actually making the degeneration worse or make it progress quicker. And so those aren't necessarily recommended for like multiple times. You usually can get one every 3 months. So that can be another thing that you're typically offered. Now, if the doctor that you're seeing is more progressive and is more kind of along the lines of, exercise and things like that, absolutely physical therapy is one of the ways to get through some of this, really start to improve strength and that sort of thing. But sometimes physical therapy may not be effective, or you may not mesh with the PT that you have. And so you can try other types of exercise programs. That's why I've really kind of started to specialize in this, because a lot of times physical therapy can, just get you to, okay, you can at least like walk around your house. You can at least do these very, very basic things. But there are people that like, I have arthritis, but I want to hike. I want to run. I want to do these things. But a lot of times we kind of, as in a traditional physical therapy world, we kind of stop at that kind of, oh, you can just walk around fine, So typically this route is going to be the conservative route of exercise. And then there are other types of things you can use, like ice, heat, knee braces, those sorts of things. Different kind of compression sleeves can be a form of treatment too. But a lot of times people aren't told about the conservative side of things, supplements, that sort of thing. And we're kind of just told about the relying on these external things like surgery, shots, injections, medication, that sort of thing. So that's right where the gap is that we're trying to close, is to educate more people that you can actually combat some of this just with exercise and things. And research is showing that it's actually almost as effective as surgery in most situations of mild to moderate osteoarthritis.
Okay, that's great, right? So mild to moderate osteoarthritis. And you had mentioned there, as you're saying, hey, if I go to my general practitioner and they take a look and they say, oh, and they tell me something, he or she says something about you have cartilage degeneration, that's alarming to me, right?
I know.
So I'm already dealing with some pain because that's how I ended there. And then I hear this kind of scary thing. But you're saying that movement actually might help that. So when you say that might help that, am I actually rehabbing that joint? Am I just relieving some of the inflammation and pain by moving? What am I doing when I start this idea of, as opposed to getting a shot or a surgery, starting to move to heal myself?
So movement is obviously something that is in your power. You're not relying on something else. Like a cortisone shot, people are like begging at 3 months to get another one. You feel like you're relying on that. Where exercise is obviously more in your control, which I think gives people more confidence. But movement, especially good movement, because a lot of times, like if you're walking primarily for exercise, walking is great, but it's very repetitive. We spend our lives in a forward position. So using exercise that way sometimes can actually be irritating. So it's finding the right type of exercise first, but it can reduce inflammation. So there's lots of research out there showing that it actually helps some of these cytokines or the inflammatory cells. It kind of helps to, I always kind of think about it as you're like kind of taking out the garbage, or you're just kind of cycling through that. It increases blood flow, which helps to move those cells through. Swelling can sometimes be a problem with arthritis. And so the more that you move your muscles, you can actually pump that out yourself for the most part. But then some overactivity can actually lead to swelling. But it can also improve that. And then stiffness is another one. Stiffness can be one of the actually most limiting symptoms in front of pain. And movement, gentle movement to start, can actually, again, get that blood flowing, reduce the inflammation, and improve your overall mobility. And so it's definitely helping primarily with inflammation, because then all these other things kind of happen. But movement can absolutely be one of the best ways to find relief from some of these symptoms. But we have to make sure it's the right type and that we're not overdoing it. Those are two of the barriers that we see. That exercise is great, but you have to make sure you're using it in the right way.
Okay, that brings up the next question then. What is the right way? And I know there's not a blanket answer, right? It's going to depend on the individual, to be sure. But what are some general things that are good for us? And maybe what are some things that might be off limits, or are things off limits for folks with, let's say, mild to medium OA?
So it kind of depends on, I wouldn't necessarily say anything is off limits. Some people are told, no squats, no lunges, no weightlifting, that sort of thing. But that is absolutely not true. Now, obviously, if your knee is flared up, a lunge probably is not going to feel great. But there are some definite modifications that you can make. Squats, another one. I'm sure so many people in your audience right now love squats and love loading up back and front squats and things. But, you can absolutely modify those. You have to be able to squat during the day. So if somebody tells you you can't squat again, that we need to have a chat, because you have to squat during the day. So different modifications and things like that. One of the biggest things that I always encourage people is to include variety. Because like I had mentioned before, like if you're walking, for example, very, very common exercise with people that have arthritis, because they're told it's one of the only safest things, which is also not true. But walking tends to, again, can sometimes flare up pain, or can kind of leave people not feeling much better, just because it's that same repetitive forward motion. Your thighs are getting a lot of work. The fronts of your hips are getting work. But what about like your glutes and your hamstrings and the backs of your legs? And so variety is key. Not doing the same thing. This even goes for cycling. If you're only cycling for exercise, that's not necessarily great either. You're neglecting some of those other muscles and movements. So I always recommend people to include some variety of side to side and backwards movement. And a big part of this is actually walking backwards can be a great thing. And I have people messaging me all the time like, hey, I was walking backwards like in my neighborhood today. My neighbors probably thought I was crazy, but, or like sideways movement. We just don't get enough variety in our daily life. Now, if you're doing CrossFit and things like that, you're obviously getting some variety, but even then we still kind of live in that forward motion. We don't necessarily get a ton of side to side or even some backwards movement. And obviously deadlifts and things like that are going to be great to work posterior chain, hamstrings, things like that. But this is also a way to prevent any joint pain or arthritis from progressing, is keeping that variety, being very, very deliberate about variety, moving side to side, even if it's just simply stepping side to side at the kitchen counter or just kind of starting to bring in some of that variety. That is where we start. And then we progress loading, strength training, all kinds of different things. But I actually have quite a few people that are doing CrossFit with arthritis. And so it's definitely starting where you're at and where your pain levels are. That's going to depend obviously on the exercises you start with, but consciously asking yourself, like, am I moving side to side somehow, some way? Am I moving backwards? And that's a good place to start.
Okay, so we want to avoid those long, repetitive movements and add some variety in there. You brought up CrossFit a couple times, and people have strong feelings one way or the other there.
Exactly.
But to your point, that's just adding that variety. And people might be surprised to hear you say that. That could be a reasonable prescription for somebody who's diagnosed with osteoarthritis, is to actually get into a gym and do intense conditioning, lift heavy weights. So, and I think that goes back to what you said, the risk factors are going to be obesity, inflammation, and inactivity. So really, this is a prescription for healthy aging, period, right? That we want to, watch our diet. We want to be active. We want to build muscle and lose that fat. Okay. So let's spend a minute and talk a little bit about how diet plays into arthritis. So you had mentioned, obviously, inflammation, and diet has a big part to play with our body's inflammation, doesn't it?
Yes. 100%. And that, like I said, that's a lot of chronic disease too. So if you can clean that up, then you can kind of prevent a lot of things.
Right. And so other than eating whole foods and eating healthy foods, is there something specific if you have an OA or any of the arthritis diagnosis? Is there anything particular that you would need to do outside of just a general prescription for eating healthy foods? Are there things you should avoid or things you should do more of?
So not particularly. I mean, it's not necessarily, rocket science with an anti-inflammatory diet. It's following a Mediterranean diet, which is one of the most recommended, which just in general, that's also recommended. But it's honestly just cutting out some of the processed foods. And that's a big thing. There are certain triggers that can actually trigger like a flare-up and things. These are going to be very widely dependent on the person though. So they're not necessarily blanket statements of like, you can never have gluten again, you can never have dairy. Those are two things that people tend to stay away from. But it's only if it's a trigger for you that you need to cut that out. One of the biggest things, and again, this is with a lot of other chronic diseases, is people always tend to focus on cutting out processed sugars, which I know a lot of people that have just done that and have seen tremendous results in their levels of inflammation and their arthritis, especially, drinking soda and things like that. All of these processed sugars. Now, fruit is not the devil. Fruit is one of the best sources of natural sugar. And so sometimes people try to make that to be the devil, but it's really not. It's just increasing your natural foods. I mean, honestly, that's kind of what it comes down to. There are a couple like spices and things, turmeric and ginger being two of them. That just things you can add to food if you like the taste. It also comes in a supplement form too. But it's honestly, I always just try to tell people, try to increase these anti-inflammatory foods, which is fruits, vegetables, primarily. Oily fish can be very, very helpful for inflammation. And just try to cut out some of the processed stuff. I mean, it's really, truly that simple. And a lot of times we try to complicate it, follow XYZ, only eat these sorts of things. And it's just, you have to start out just making 2 or 3 substitutions, because it needs to be a lifestyle thing, not try this for 6 weeks and then you're done with it sort of thing.
If you're going to live with this for the rest of your life, you need to have a sustainable way of eating.
Exactly.
And I suppose that's a good point. I just made an assumption there. If I go to the doctor, my doctor says, okay, you have osteoarthritis. Do I have that for the rest of my life? Can I be cured? Can I reverse it? Or do I just manage it?
So there's not a cure. And so it is something that will continue to stick with you. But I always tell people, focusing on what you can do, not necessarily the diagnosis itself, but there are people that are running with it. There are people that are, lifting weights. There are people who are out there doing miles and miles of backpacking trips. And they all have arthritis. And it is so common as we get older to get some joint pain, some stiffness, because our joints are aging just like the rest of our body is. And I mean, if you think of a car, it's going to start to show some wear eventually. But that wear does not have to necessarily mean severe debility and severe pain. So you can absolutely reverse the symptoms. You can reverse the severity of them, at least, where it's just, you have a little bit of stiffness in the morning, but then it doesn't really limit you from doing anything. And that's the ultimate goal. Is I want you to be able to live the adventures that you want to, be able to do the things that you want to without it limiting you or holding you back from doing something. I always tell people to measure your progress based on decreased pain, frequency, and severity instead of just, I still have pain. And so we have to kind of think of it that way. But unfortunately, there's no cure, but you can absolutely live your life to the fullest with it.
Okay, I love that. You can absolutely love your life to the fullest, even if you have this. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And you've mentioned adventures several times here in our conversation today. I do want to come back to that. But before we go there, is there a different recommendation for an aging individual with arthritis when it comes to recovery than there would be just for an athlete of aging? Does he or she need to consider recovery more than, say, an average person or a person who doesn't suffer from arthritis?
So I think a big thing there is volume. And it kind of depends on your training volume and what you're used to. So somebody who's, hasn't exercised for a couple of years and wants to get back into it, recovery is a huge part of it. So you want to make sure, because even sometimes if you don't have pain during or stiffness during, you have some afterwards. And so sometimes your joints can react adversely afterwards. And so obviously if that's the case, then we kind of change the training volume and try to figure out what your threshold is. And each person's threshold is going to be different. And so if you are starting out lifting weights and things like that, you may need a day to recover. And as we get older, it takes us a little bit longer to recover whether we have arthritis or not. So, and it also depends on your training intensity too. I have some people alternate days of, higher intensity, lower intensity, higher intensity, lower intensity, or we just work out for 10 to 15 minutes. And that is a manageable thing for them to continue to do. So like any fitness program or anything, it is very, very modifiable to you and how you respond. But one of the biggest things is protein as we get older, and kind of touching back to the diet thing helps with recovery, but we tend to decrease our protein as we get older. And so that is one big thing that I find almost 9 out of 10 people I see aren't getting enough protein. And that's obviously going to impact your recovery if you're not able to repair those muscles that you're now breaking down. Nor is it going to improve strength if you're not getting the right protein. So that's a big thing with recovery, but it's all kind of just about how your body responds. People can work out every day and have no issue, but they might be doing a little bit lower impact or a little bit, lighter strength training to start. And then it's all kind of dependent on what you feel you need.
Yeah, and that's a good point you made about the protein. I think that is something that surprises a lot of people when you ask people for the first time to say track their macros and their calories. And they look and see how much, especially older individuals, we're not synthesizing protein the same way we did. And turns out we're not nutrient sensing it the same way we did when we were younger. And so we need more, not less protein, especially if we're active and trying to build and maintain muscle, which is critical as we age, whether you have arthritis or not. And so I think it's Dr. Gabriel Lyon who describes muscle as the organ of longevity. And so that's certainly another nutritional piece that we can take away is we want to reduce our processed foods and certainly increase that protein. All right. Well, we talked about adventure. You've mentioned it several times here. I think the name of your company is Keep Adventure Alive. Is that right?
Yes.
All right. Well, let's talk about that. Talk to us about why that name. You're obviously reaching out to people with osteoarthritis. What's the adventure in keeping the adventure alive?
Because people with arthritis are discouraged to adventure, and that tends to just tear me apart. So we moved to Utah about a year ago from the Midwest, and there's lots of adventure out here, and there's lots of types of adventures. So biking, skiing, hiking, all kinds of different things. And there are people of all ages out there, and there are people, you get a free ski pass if you're over 80 and skiing. And it's just in our society right now, that is considered extraordinary. If you're still doing that, it's like, wow, even if you can still like squat at a pretty fairly decent depth, wow, I can't believe that you can still do that. It's considered extraordinary, which is so crazy to me. And so it's time to kind of change the narrative of being able to adventure. And adventure doesn't have to be going up into the mountains. Adventure could be running on the playground with your grandkids or something like that. It's very, very personable to you. But if you do a Google search of older people with arthritis or older people osteoarthritis, you see walkers, canes. People are rarely ever alone because they can't maybe do anything on their own. And so that's where it stems from, is we have to start to change this narrative. You don't see basically none of, skiers or hikers or bikers when you are older. And that is just how our society is ingrained, is it's just considered extraordinary to be doing kind of normal physical activity just as you get older. And so I want to show people that adventure is possible, because instead of being given this long list of things that you can't do, no high impact, no blah, 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 just ski or just bike and swim, low impact thing is what you can do for the rest of your life. No, there are people that can get back to jumping with their kids. There are people that can get back to running and doing all of these active things, but that's not necessarily something that we're told we can do, or you're kind of fearful. I have a lot of people that are just fearful of movement in general, and it's getting back to actually doing whatever adventure makes you happy. But knowing that it's possible and knowing that there's hope for that kind of stuff can be extremely powerful, especially if you're told that you have a diagnosis that, quite frankly, doesn't have a cure.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think a lot of folks, to your point, just our culture in general has this expectation of aging people. We're just slowing down, and we're becoming weaker, and we're not being very active. When in case you and I are both trying to change that narrative, right? We say, no, it doesn't have to be that way. Yeah. So, and specifically for somebody who's had a scary diagnosis, for somebody like you to bring awareness to this and say, well, wait, yes, it's scary. And yes, you have some certain limitations and there's some discomfort associated with that, but that doesn't mean that your life is over, or that adventure is over for you, and however you define adventure. And I've seen you on your website with your shirt that says adventure has no age limit on there, which is a fantastic message. So it's really bringing that awareness and that hope to people to say, hey, this is possible and these people are doing it, and come join our tribe, right?
Yeah. Hope is a really powerful thing, whether you have arthritis or not. As you get older, again, it kind of follows that same narrative, but there's hope to still be doing the things that you don't just automatically have to give up things just because you're older. I think it's becoming more mainstream now that with like social media outlets and things like that, like Train with Joan, who's 70 plus and lifting weights and things like, maybe I could do that sort of thing. Right. So I think that that's been really positive, but hope is a very powerful thing.
Yeah, it certainly is. Okay, well, I know you've also written a book. It's Move Well, Age Well, How to Rock the Later Years with Fitness and Mindset. Now, that book, is that an arthritis book, or is that just, hey, as you're getting older, this is how you rock your later years?
It is kind of just more of a general. There is a chapter on arthritis just because it's fairly common. But it's just kind of a general quick read to get some motivation. And I always tell people that, even if you do get a copy, to read it and then pass it on to somebody else, because it is a quick read, just gives some general type tips on strength training and balance and all kinds of stuff. But it's meant to just kind of light your fire a little bit, especially if you know someone who's maybe not, super motivated to get going, or maybe just needs a little bit of help, whether it's your parents, grandparents, or just neighbors, anyone who just needs a little bit of a push. It's just more towards like healthy aging type things, but more of an empowering, here's how you get started, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And so that leads me nicely into my next question, because I think that it can be intimidating, especially for older adults, to start a fitness journey. And I hadn't really thought about it before our discussion here, but it could be doubly intimidating if you're dealing with pain, if you're dealing with a scary diagnosis from your doctor. Hey, you've got some cartilage degeneration or some bone on bone. And those are scary things to hear. What advice do you have for, say, that woman in her 60s who's hearing this and maybe doesn't have a background in fitness? How does she get started on this journey to kind of reclaiming some of this adventure we're talking about?
I would 110% invest in somebody that can help you, at least to get started. Because there are so many people that try to do it on their own, try to, waste their time trying to find all of these different things. Or maybe you try exercise, you try some program that worked for a friend, and it ended up flaring up your pain. A lot of people then tend to say, oh, you know what, exercise just isn't for me. Give it up kind of globally, and then kind of get into this pattern of inactivity. It is 100% worth it to even invest in just a couple of sessions just to get some guidance from a healthcare professional that, one, you trust, but two, that actually understands and listens to what you want. So it's not just, go through this cookie cutter format or try, just this general thing. It's, you want to run, instead of saying, oh, I don't know if running is going to be possible for you. It's okay. We are going to do our very best to get you there. And so finding somebody, whether it's a physical therapist, a trainer, somebody that you trust, that is going to help you get closer to your goals and not kind of lump you into this low level arthritis group, that no, you can actually do these things and you can actually strength train and all of that. So that is very, very important. Instead of just trying to figure it out on your own, it saves so much time. And the longer you wait and the longer that you're trying to kind of figure this stuff out, the pain could be getting worse and you could be getting into, having limited mobility, and it just makes it a little bit harder. So the quicker you get started and the quicker you get on the right path, the better. So I would find someone absolutely that you trust and that can get you closer to those goals.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And now, would it be important for somebody with an arthritis diagnosis, to maybe look for somebody who has experience with that population? Because it seems to me that, certainly if you walk into a Globo gym and there's trainers there, right, those folks may or may not be able to have an adequate prescription for fitness and wellness for these folks. Would it be more important for that population to seek somebody who's got specific arthritis background?
Oh, I 100% agree. Think about when you're going to like a doctor or something. If you have problems with your heart, would you feel much more confident going to a cardiologist or just kind of a general, now there are some general practitioners, general physical therapists, et cetera, that have decent experience with arthritis, whether they are outward about it or not. You can also just use like the trust of people that like, hey, this therapist or this trainer or this whatever did really well for me, like maybe you should try them. So word of mouth, I think, is a big part too. But I think any sort of person that you can find that has more of a specialty, like I have honed in on arthritis. I exclusively see people with arthritis. And so that can be helpful, finding patterns and finding things that work and things that don't work. And it can help you just kind of get a clear path. I'm always reading research and things. And then when you're a generalist, then you don't necessarily have time to kind of dive deep into different things. And so it can absolutely be helpful if you find someone who, at least, I think dealing even just with an aging population in general can help. Just because sometimes people try to start way too fast or they don't really know how to modify things. And so if you're kind of getting that vibe, then there are people out there that can absolutely help.
That's great. And I agree wholeheartedly. I think that puts you in a special population, right? If you're aging, you're already in a special population, but certainly
Right.
if you're aging and dealing with something like OA, you're in a special population and you probably want to find somebody who has some experience there. So speaking of that, if somebody's listening to this now and they would like to reach out to you, can they work with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am everywhere on social media and even just on my website. So you can just book a free 15-minute phone call where we just kind of chat about your situation and find the best path for you. So it's just keeptheadventurealive.com. You can also find me on YouTube if you do want to learn a little bit more and get started. You can search Arthritis Adventure, or you can search Dr. Alyssa Kuhn, Kuhn, and my channel will pop up. And that's a good place to start, just to kind of get some more background information and see what things are possible. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook, I'm everywhere. If you just type in Keep the Adventure Alive, you'll probably find me somewhere. But yes, I do offer those free consultations. You can message me, you can reach out on any of those platforms, and we can absolutely get started.
Okay, and I can drop all that into the show notes so folks can find all that there as well. And so, Alyssa, what's next for you? What's on the horizon?
So I am in the process of developing my online course, because I was doing one-on-one people here locally in Utah, but it's so much more of a national problem, and so many more people need help than just, my little 10-mile radius. And so I'm developing the Arthritis Adventure Blueprint, which is available now. And I'm putting some people, even that are bone on bone, even that really think that they cannot get better, that it's actually working and people are actually finding relief and finding that hope and confidence again. And so it's really kind of working on spreading that message, which is my next big push towards, instead of just locally here, we're going to expand nationally and even internationally. I have people that are joining me from Australia, the Philippines. I mean, it's everywhere, but it's just changing that narrative and working every single day to try to get this in the hands of more people and to spread the hope and optimism, even with arthritis.
Great. So that blueprint offering, would that have like a community aspect to it? Or?
So I have a Facebook group.
Okay. So okay, great. Yeah. So talk a little bit about that, because I think that's important if somebody's maybe feeling kind of isolated or hearing this message for the first time. How do they connect with other people who are a little further along this path?
Yeah, totally. So I have a free Facebook group. You can find that on my Instagram. You can find links to it. You can find that on Facebook. It's just Keeping Your Osteoarthritis Adventure Alive. So if you just type in Keep the Adventure Alive, I'm sure you'll see it, or find me on Facebook and you'll see a link. But yeah, there's almost 1,000 people in that group that are, and this group is not necessarily like a negativity, like post all your pains, post all your woes. It's motivating and empowering. That's kind of what the community aspect is that we're trying to bring in, that it's not, being negative. I think there's a lot of negativity out there in some of these larger groups. And so it's a much more positive atmosphere than some of the other traditional groups.
Okay. And again, I'll drop all of that into the show notes so folks that want to connect with Alyssa can go there, and certainly would encourage you to check out. She's got a very large and active YouTube channel. I'll put that in there and go to the website. And obviously in this day and age, everybody's doing remote consultations, so they can reach out to you and do that as well. All righty. Yes. Well, Alyssa, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today and sharing your time and your wisdom with us. I think what you're doing is fantastic, right? That you're reaching out to this particular population, and I wish you all the best in all your future endeavors.
I appreciate that so much. Thank you.
Okay, folks, that's our show for this week. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation as much as I did. As we wrap up today's show, I have a favor to ask. Would you share this episode with someone who either suffers from arthritis or has a family member that does? Alyssa's message is so fresh and filled with so much hope. Let's try and spread this inspiration to those that need it. Now, statistics tell us that only 15% of people over 55 listen to podcasts. So the easiest way to share this episode is to send them the link to this show, and they can listen right there on the website. The link is www.silveredgefitness.com/episode 75. And there you'll also find all the links to the resources we discussed in this episode, and you can continue the conversation over there as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments on today's show. As we wrap up our time together today, you can always show your support for this show by giving this podcast a 5-star review on whatever platform you listen to podcasts on, and be sure to subscribe and follow so you don't miss any future episodes. I really appreciate you spending your time with me today, and until next time, stay strong.